years ago, I got involved with a clean energy startup project at Millikan University. Another student, Hunter, joined at the same time as me. Wanting to get more involved in entrepreneurship, we jumped right in and began applying to pitch competitions. For those of you who aren't familiar with those, many colleges across the country hold these national pitch competitions for students to share their business ideas and try to win seed funding to turn them into a reality. Hunter and I created and recreated our business model many times over while applying to as many competitions as we possibly could. We finally got accepted into 2, but there were a couple of hitches. The first issue was that both competitions took place on the same exact day in 2 different states. The second issue was that one of the competitions required that the leader and the presenter of the team be a female. This may not seem like a big deal, but the other competition was TCU's Values and Ventures, and it required a 15-minute pitch, whereas the women's competition was set up like an expo. So being the overachiever I am, I wanted to do the big pitch at the major university instead of sharing our idea on a poster board among 50 other teams. But after careful consideration, we decided it would be best to compete in both and increase our chances of winning funding. So Hunter went to Texas and I went to Boston. The difference was Hunter competed among diverse teams of students whose main criteria for being there was to have an idea that served a social or environmental purpose. Whereas the main criteria for my competition was to be a woman. In fact, you could have male teammates, but they weren't even allowed to speak to the judges. The structure of this competition begs the question, what was accomplished by segregating genders and mandating leadership to women? Doesn't this sound awfully familiar to the very long history of patriarchal structures and gender separation imposed by the society that we live in? When Martin Luther King Jr. marched on Washington, was he fighting for further segregation of races? Of course not. That would be preposterous, right? So why then have we created these women-only competitions, organizations, and events? A proponent of such women's-only groups may suggest that women were already cut off, and they're just trying to make the best of what they were given. Or maybe they're trying to address the very real problem of sexism that still permeates our society. But I would suggest that they are treating a symptom, and not the disease. The disease is an imbalanced culture that isolates individuals based on gender, race, and religion. So while women's-only groups may eventually cure some of the horrid symptoms that affect women, we're still not addressing the underlying disease that created these symptoms for women and for countless other groups of people. In other words, we can change out the variables of victimization, but without changing the formula, there will be no end to the cruelties and oppression of other groups. So what is the root problem, and how did we get here? Well, there are countless factors at play that have accumulated for millennia, but let's focus on 2 major ones today. In a study published in the Journal of Social Experimental Psychology, participants were shown women on a range from a low to a high body ratio index. They were then asked to rate the degree of similarity between pairs of women based on their body ratio. In the second phase, some participants were given labels attached with the woman, from normal to anorexic to obese. In the third phase, the same participants were told by expert nutritionists that the labels were inaccurate and should not be used by medical professionals. The results of the study showed that when the labels were present, participants saw women who shared the same label as being highly similar, whereas they were extremely different from those with another label. This is similar to a phenomenon known as hypersegregation, coined by Douglas Massey, a sociologist. Hypersegregation is when a group of individuals are seen as being extremely similar to each other, while at the same time are being cut off and isolated from the rest of society. This system of labeling, categorizing, and judging is cemented into our culture through the patriarchal structures we have in place. The disease, which I'll call binary structures, creates awful symptoms and divisiveness. And I believe that women's only events and organizations are further spreading this disease. My second example is Enron. Enron provides a really great insight into what happens when we treat people like objects. If you aren't familiar with the story of Enron, you can check out the documentary or the book. It's called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. But for today, I'll just give a brief overview. In 1985, the federal government deregulated natural gas pipelines. And after that, one major gas company merged with another major pipeline company to create Enron. However, this merger created massive debt, so the company had to get creative to stay afloat. The CEO, Kenneth Lay, hired a young consultant named Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling had a background in asset and liability management, and he came up with this idea of a gas bank, where Enron would purchase gas from a number of suppliers and sell it out to a network of consumers. Enron would assume all of the risk while guaranteeing both the supply and the price, all for a fee, of course. So the idea worked really well, and the CEO, Lay, was so thrilled that he created an entirely new division called Enron Finance Corp, and he promoted Skilling to be the leader. This position pretty much gave Skilling free rein to do whatever he wanted, so he went around changing the company culture to basically mimic Wall Street. It wasn't long before employees were getting assigned ratings based on how much profit they were producing, with the thought of being fired always looming overhead. Internal competition was brutal, and immediate reward was valued over long-term success. This mindset of do whatever it takes to make money today infused every decision made at Enron for years on end. To ensure its stock would continue rising, Enron cooked the books and made false profits appear out of nowhere and made losses disappear into fake companies. As many of you may already know, the outcome of such selfish, short-sighted action was a result of 20,000 jobs lost, millions in retirement funds lost, and the downfall of the major accounting firm that did Enron's books. Corporate greed may come to mind as the motivating factor here, but I don't believe it tells the whole story. Those who act only in their own interest and use everyone around them as pawns act as if they're invincible, like nothing can ever touch them. Think about it. If you could do whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, with no consequence, eventually you may start to believe you're invincible too. But with that mentality, people are just objects, a means to an end. We can all think of some hyper-masculine people in power, people who think that because they're at the top, it's okay to do whatever they want. So there's plenty of people out there who act as if they're invincible. And then there are these binary structures that reinforce that belief. And these structures are what creates the division and oppression for so many groups of people. This creates a continuous cycle of separation, belittlement, and contempt that develops into sexism, racism, and classism. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. So I'd like to point out that while Skilling and Lay typically get blamed for the Enron catastrophe, many of their employees were responsible as well. And they weren't all men either. Hypermasculinity can be found in anyone, and it should be addressed regardless of biological sex. Okay, so what do Enron and hypermasculinity have to do with feminism? Feminism becomes a toxin when it begins to take on the form of the disease, when it creates a type of hyper-segregation that leads to even bigger gaps among categorized groups of people. In this effort to prove that a woman can do anything a man can do and more while wearing heels, we are only fighting the disease with its very own symptoms of aggression and oppression. Being feminine is often associated with empathy, caring, and service to others. So just like hypermasculinity manifests itself as overcompetitiveness, aggression, and using people as objects, the extreme end of feminism looks like overextending oneself and burning out in an attempt to force oneself into the patriarchal structure. So while women's only organizations and events are certainly a noble and reasonable response to a very painful occurrence, it's not a comprehensive solution. Instead, we need a healthy balance of empathy, acceptance, and servitude combined with competition, drive, and self-care. We must shift our cultural values from acting invincible and hyper-segregation to vulnerability, humanity, and connection. By transforming our individual and societal beliefs, we can begin to dissolve the patriarchal structures that enforce binaries and separation. I'm not suggesting that we eradicate femininity or masculinity. What I am suggesting is that we embrace both as equally important characteristics and behaviors, without letting either one go to the extreme. Let's take a hint from the Tao and begin to practice dynamic balance. For example, when a trained seal balances a ball on its nose, it is constantly making slight adjustments to move back towards center. Likewise, we must make conscious movement toward an open dialogue without attached ideologies or identifications. To quote the author of In a Different Voice, Carol Gilligan, if along the path we lose our way, we must remind ourselves to listen for voice, to pay attention to how things are gendered, and know that within ourselves we have the ability to spot a false story. Instead of succumbing to a patriarchy or trying to enforce a matriarchy, let's focus on democratic communication, where differing opinions and views are openly accepted without judgment of gender, race, religion. And let's not mistake compassion for weakness here. It takes bravery and courage to be vulnerable and to trust in others, because we will get hurt sometimes, and that is certainly a scary thing. But use that pain as a way to fuel yourself to be even more compassionate. Treat people as fellow beings on the same walk of life, not as objects to be used or categories to be labeled. One of the hardest things to do in life is love others, which is probably why we've put up such high barriers around us. Let's not create another one by further isolating women from the rest of society. Let's break down the barriers of separation and be unapologetically vulnerable.